I'll leave it to Paul to introduce the panelists and describe to you how the day is going to go here. We've got 3 panel conversations. Beyond that, I'll let Paul give you the highlights. I wouldn't do my job if I didn't tell you very quickly about CCOM. We got started roughly 45 years ago, almost 45 years ago. Next year will be our 45th anniversary year. And we've done a lot of different work in this community over those 45 years. And we've had some major victories along the way that I hope accrue to all of us in terms of making this a truly livable community. At this point, we're focused on 4 key areas. The first one, which I won't bore you with details because we're going to talk about it for a couple hours here, is sustainable fisheries. I think that piqued your interest and got you in the door, so I'll leave that one aside for a moment. The next one is water quality, which obviously is related directly to sustainable fisheries. If you're going to pull fish out of the water, we need those estuaries, we need those hatcheries, we need those marshlands. We need to be doing the right things on the upland, and everything we do on the upland has an impact on the quality of the water that's in Lake Montauk, that's offshore, the breeding grounds for these fish. So, we need to draw the connections between the sustainable fisheries part of this and the water quality part of it. Next project that we're working on in a major way for this year and next year is coastal policy. Hurricane Sandy came roaring through here 2 years ago, and we all took a moment and said, wow, what are the lessons of this storm? Where do we go from here? What would we do differently? I'm afraid we've lost a little bit of that momentum at the community level. And we're trying to really work with officials from the federal level, the state level, the county level, and the town level to get us re-energized into a vigorous coastal planning process that hopefully gets us to a more sane place where we're making more rational decisions about what we build, where we build, why we build, and trying to build in that word that we keep hearing so much, resilience, into everything that we do in our community. The fourth area that I have to touch on briefly is, we take a strong stand against what we consider ill-conceived development proposals that come into our community. So when you tie together water quality, when you're looking at sustainable fisheries, when you're looking at sensible coastal policy, sometimes somebody comes walking in the door and says, I want to build something really big in exactly the wrong place, and I think you should all be okay with it. We're the guys that stand up and say, I don't agree with that proposal, and here's why. And we try to make sound, rational, scientifically based arguments about water quality, about coastal policy, about sustainable fisheries when we do that. So hopefully I've tied all of those together for you, piqued your interest a little bit. We have plenty of material in the other room when you're leaving. Feel free to ask me questions. We've got stuff over there that you can take home with you. If you're not a member of CCOM, but something like this got you in the door today, I would ask you to support our work because we can't do stuff like this without you being there. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul Greenberg and just say, if you have questions at the end, please hit all of us. We're all here to try to share a community-based dialogue and figure out where the overlaps are on these issues so that we can identify some real solutions going forward. So with that, Paul. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy, and concerned citizens of Montauk, not just for hosting this event, but for defending the kind of Montauk that I fell in love with as an 8-year-old. I was a divorced kid, so I learned to fish with my dad, and the best present that my dad could offer me was a weekend in Montauk. And it took a lot of badgering and a lot of harassment to get out to Montauk, but once we were here, it was truly the land of adventure, the land of magic, and the land of truly great fish. So it's very, very dear to my heart, and I'm really glad that we can all hopefully have a part in really keeping Montauk Montauk. A little bit just to sort of frame what we're going to talk about today. So I live all the way downtown in Manhattan. I live so far downtown that it's almost uptown. I mean, it's really, I live in basically near Ground Zero, and it was once upon a time called New Amsterdam. And I moved there for a girl, for the real estate, but in the end, when I started walking around the neighborhood, I was kind of put off. It was 2005 when I moved down, and I found it to be kind of a glassy, cold, sterile place. It's now called the Financial District. And all there were banks and brokerage houses, which if you're a writer and a fisherman, banks and brokerage houses don't really work very well with your life. So one day I kind of wandered down east towards the East River very early in the morning, and I happened to stumble upon the Fulton Fish Market. 2005, and the Fulton Fish Market was at that point in full tilt. There was all sorts of really interesting stuff going on there, and for the first time I felt like maybe my industrialized, financialized, completely non-organic neighborhood might have something real to it. And I really loved the Fulton Fish Market. It was really some place that really seemed to breathe life and really kind of had the sense that reminded you that Manhattan was an island and that this city was once upon a time a fishing city. Of course, a few months later, after I moved in, the Fulton Fish Market closed. And it got sent all the way up to the Bronx. And I remember I was talking with a fishmonger up there at the new Fulton Fish Market up in the Bronx. And I said, how do you feel about being up here in the Bronx? And he said, you know where they put us? Right here. And it kind of got me thinking, and I started thinking about the position of fish and fisheries in general in the context of the larger American picture. And that's when I kind of started getting acquainted with the fact that even though the United States controls more ocean than any country on Earth, something like 2.8 billion acres, more than 85% of the fish that Americans eat is imported, is coming to us from abroad. I remember anybody here ever do business with Herb Slavin? Any hands? So, well, you know, over on this side. So you know Herb is a certain kind of very funny guy and tough guy. And I said to Herb when I was up there at the Fulton Market, at the New Market, I said, Herb, what do you think about the fact that more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad? And without missing a beat, he goes, "Who's the broad?" and I was like, "What?" And he's like, "The lady, the lady with all the fish." So I tried to kind of catch up with him. And then I realized he totally knew what I was talking about. He totally understood that the American seafood system has really radically changed over the last 20 to 30 years, to the point where, as I say, more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad. And I want to keep my comments short because I want to get through this great first panel. But suffice to say, 6, I would say, of the top 10 most consumed species, the number, I would say 5 of the number of 10 most consumed species are coming to us primarily from abroad. And one of the most markedly noticeable things, and as I've been working with Carolyn Hall over there in the back, a historical marine ecologist, and Carolyn's been doing really interesting work where she's been analyzing menus from New York City over the past 150 years and looking at how the American seafood diet has changed over time. Many trends are apparent in those very interesting menus. A lot of shad used to be on New York menus. But one of the biggest shifts that you will see, and the most notable, it's hard to do historical marine ecology because you have to work with things like menus, with anecdotes. How do you establish a scientific trend from just wispy memories that aren't really in the data set? But one thing, it's a very, very, very clear signal that happens between, say, 1880 and about 1940, is the decline of oysters and the rise of shrimp. It used to be the average New Yorker ate 600 local New York City oysters per person per year. There used to be a variety of oysters in New York called a gowanus. There was a gowanus oyster. Go on. I will go on. Now, of course, the gowanus is a Superfund site. So it's not what it was. But there used to be several trillion oysters inhabiting the greater New York bight, and they turned the water column over probably every 2 to 3 weeks. It was an amazing biodynamic system that we transformed from a food system into a waste disposal system. Why it's relevant here, I think, we're all the way out in the end of Long Island at Montauk, and the possibility of Montauk becoming New York seems very slight. But I think we see the process. I mean, certainly you certainly see lots of New York stores in East Hampton, but that's another story. But what you do see is a food system being transformed from a food system into a vacation system, into something that's really for much more trivial things than feeding the country. So, and where I feel like this is really immediately relevant has to do with the shellfish industry. And that's why I wanted to have this first panel really look at the shellfish situation here on the East End. So we have a really great panel here today. We have Nat Miller, who's 13th generation shellfish fisherman and producer here. We have Barley Dunn, who runs the East Hampton Shellfish Hatchery, correct? Mike Dole and Mike Martinson, both who run together. Is a company actually called Montauk Pearl, or is that the Montauk Shellfish Company, right? That's and right. Montauk Pearl is your pride and joy, I would suppose. So I'm going to have each of these guys say, a little bit about what they're doing, what their perspective on, and then, like with each of the following panels, we'll have time for discussion. And then we have a meal service happening between panels 1 and 2. So yeah, between panels 1 and 2, there'll be food brought out. We'll probably push right through and do the next panel while people are eating. The next panel is going to be on restaurant relationships to seafood, and then the final one will really look at management and questions of finfish production here on the East End. So let's start, I think, with Nat. If you can tell us a little bit about what you do.
Thank you for having me. My name is Nathaniel Miller. I'm a 13th generation Miller from East Hampton, a 4th generation Warple from Amagansett. And myself and my whole family, for those generations, for the most part, have made their living off the water. I fish pound traps, still fish the ocean with the dory, gill nets. I clam, oyster, and scallop in the fall to winter months. We do mostly traditional baymen and surfmen stuff. We still make our own gear. We still build our own boats, wooden boats. I survive off of quality and good price, not quantity. We keep our expenses low. And I am proof, as a young man living in East Hampton, I can still afford a mortgage. I have a child, and if you work hard, you will succeed. But there's a lot of things that have to be changed or realized. I'm 35 years old, and when 10, 12 years old, when I was clamming, every restaurant in town would crave local clams. Clam Bar in Nat Pig would pay 26 cents a net. That's 20 years ago. I mean, we're talking 50 or 60 cents a net now. And now the markets are 20 cents to 22 cents. And of course, the cost of living has grown tremendously in East Hampton. A lot of the seafood and fish that mostly seafood, but a lot of my shellfish does say local, or I don't go because I can't afford to go shellfishing. We'll go to New York City, then come back here. That's a 200-mile round trip for nothing, not to mention a week. During the scallop season is where I generate most of my shellfish money, and the reason is because the local community, there's not the tourists out here then, a lot of the restaurants aren't open, but all locals want the bay scallops, and they are willing to give me a good price because they understand gasoline is high. They understand I'm still paying a mortgage, and they want to see a fisherman survive, because out of the local baymen and all the history I have, there's only 3 or 4 full-time baymen left in East Hampton. And we were taught by our fathers and grandfathers, and if my son chooses, I'd like to teach him. Wild versus farms. I know a lot of commercial guys say they don't like farms. That's a myth. Most of all fishermen like the farms. They don't bother them. There's always a demand for wild stock, and there always will be a demand for wild stock. And I've never seen a problem with the two intertwining or being a problem, saying that there's too much of a supply, lowering the price. It doesn't happen that way. Some of the problems I feel that we face is what I like to call NIMBY, not in our backyard. No one wants to see you clamming or fishing or doing anything, but they want to eat it at the restaurants. No one wants to see the shellfish hatcheries and stuff like that, but this is where it's coming from. This is what it has been and what it always will be. Another problem we have is simple human greed. Some people aren't going out. I make a living day's pay at a time. Chasing rainbows, you're never going to find the end. If you work hard every day and go catch your can of clams or your whatever fish, at the end of the week you have a paycheck. And that leads to a lot of people poaching and looking for easy money and not abiding by the limits and the rules. And the rules are in place for a reason, and they make sense. I mean, I would rather go to work for a month than have someone poach everything and it's gone, and that seems to be a real big problem. To be honest with the shellfish, that's just about all I have, so turn it over to Mr. Barley.
Yeah. So,
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Thanks to CCOM and Deb and Paul for having this panel. I'm here on the side of the shellfish restoration side of things. The East Hampton Shellfish Hatchery was established in the late 80s, basically in response to 3 main events. One is the brown tide, which probably everybody has heard of. This is a toxic algae bloom that swept through the area and really decimated all the shellfish stocks by shading out the favorable foods for the shellfish, killing off eelgrass, and shellfish populations were the harvest plummeted to about 10 to 20% of their pre-bloom levels. So the brown tide, accompanied by a striped bass closure due to PCBs that were sourced in the Hudson, which affected Nat and his crew from catching stripers off the beach, and also shellfish closures due to E. coli, which is a result of development. So these three sort of nails in the coffin, if you will, help to establish the shellfish hatchery. And we have a hatchery in Montauk right behind us, right on the other side of the railroad tracks. We grow oysters, clams, and scallops. And the mission basically is to grow as much seed as possible over the course of a year and get that stuff seeded out into the town of East Hampton's harbors and bays, where it'll then mature, doing its thing as it matures, filtering the bays, providing habitat, and then eventually, hopefully, some folks can go out there recreationally or commercially and harvest the shellfish. And part of the mission is to keep folks like Nat and his crew and his friends and family on the water, harvesting shellfish. So, as Paul mentioned, shellfish on Long Island and in Manhattan are really world-renowned, or at least used to be. The Queen of England preferred Long Island oysters, believe it or not. They were shipped hundreds of thousands of barrels per year over to England. And the bay scallop, world-renowned also. But all of these things have depleted, and it's really hard to restore it with all the other factors fighting against it, such as development, water quality. So I consider myself lucky to be in this industry. It's a very thankful job. But our mission is to get folks like Nat and other recreational types out there digging up clams, oysters, and scallops, and to keep these harbors pristine and keep the tourism draw as far as the ecology and the state of the harbors and bays as it is. Kept that short and sweet. Probably missed a few things, but I'd like to pass it on to Mike. And hopefully, we're hoping for lots of questions from you folks. Thanks for coming on this beautiful day.
All right, well, my name is Mike Dole, and first I'd just like to say thank you to Paul, and thank you to concerned citizens of Montauk for inviting me here. Really is an honor to come here and just share a couple of thoughts and beliefs about a subject that I'm really passionate about. So I'm the co-founder of Montauk Shellfish Company, along with my partner Mike Martinson. And prior to forming this company in 2009, we're an aquaculture company, primarily right now growing oysters in Montauk. But prior to that, I worked as a marine scientist for pretty much my whole career at Stony Brook University for nearly 20 years. And I did research on a variety of local marine issues, but my main focus, especially over the last 10 to 12 years or so, has been shellfish ecology and shellfish restoration. And through my research and studies and just life experiences as a native Long Islander, I've come to realize that shellfish are an extremely important part of our ecosystems, and I believe shellfish restoration is one of the number one things we need to address in order to promote the health and vitality of our estuaries on Long Island. And to that end, I've become a strong believer in aquaculture and the role that aquaculture needs to play now and moving forward into the future. I think aquaculture needs to be a part of the American catch moving forward for sustainable seafood production, but it also needs to be a part of management plans for improving the health of our bays and estuaries. And it also needs to play a role for restoration purposes. One of the big obstacles to restoration right now, especially in Long Island waters, is that the source populations have been depleted. Paul mentions in his book, when he's talking about the New York oyster, I love the part where you're trying to find an oyster in New York Harbor, and it's almost impossible now to find an oyster in New York Harbor. When you go back 100 years ago, New York Harbor was producing 700 million oysters a year going around the country. Now you can't find one. And I've done some studies in New York Harbor where we were trying to look for oyster recruitment, oyster larvae settling. Could not find a single oyster in Jamaica Bay over 2 years, a natural oyster in Jamaica Bay. So there's some big challenges to oyster restoration. We've depleted population so much, we've crossed the threshold, that it's going to really take a massive effort on a very large scale if we're going to try to bring these resources back. And aquaculture can play a big role in that. One case study I just wanted to bring up because it's something that I've worked on a lot. It's something on a personal level that got me into marine science, and it's an issue that I've worked on. Is the hard clam fishery of the Great South Bay in the 1970s. And I born and raised on the South Shore of Long Island in the 1970s. And at that time, clams and the clam fishery was just a very big part of our culture on Long Island. I don't come from a fishing family. We want clammers ourselves, but just amongst the whole community, clams were an important part. If you weren't clamming yourself, you had a neighbor or a relative, or a friend who was clamming, and every neighborhood had a clammer, and every party there was clams being served, and it was just a big part of our community. And I remember as a kid going over. My mom would take me to the beach just about every day, and crossing over the Robert Moses Bridge or the Jones Beach Bridge. I would look out the backseat window, and just it was amazing how many boats were on the water clamming. And I can picture in my head, trying to jump across the bay from boat to boat without going to the water. It was really that many boats. And through the early 80s, the number of boats just kept decreasing, and the number of people you knew that were clamming just kept decreasing until finally there was pretty much nobody on the bay clamming. And I didn't, at the time as a kid, it was nothing I was conscious of. You kind of just took it for granted. It wasn't until I started doing research on shellfish that I realized how prominent the Great South Bay shellfish clam industry was. Through the mid-1970s, the Great South Bay, which is only about 100 square mile bay, produced over half of the entire nation's harvest of hard clams, which is just, I found mind-blowing. 2 out of every 3 clams on the East Coast that were eaten came from Great South Bay. It became known as the greatest hard clam factory in the world. I think at its peak in like 1976, it produced about 700,000 bushels of clams. Today, it's much less than 10,000 bushels of clams. 6,000 jobs were lost. That's just direct clamming jobs. There was about 6,000 clammers making a living on the Great South Bay in the 70s. Today, really, it's just a handful of people. So it was an important resource that we've lost. And my time's up, so I can't speak to everything I want. But I just want to end by saying, aquaculture can play a role in restoring shellfish. Each oyster farm, each clam farm is a little spawner sanctuary. And as we grow the shellfish, they're producing larvae and babies that help populate help repopulate the wild populations. And at the same time, the oysters and clams are performing all sorts of ecosystem services of filtering the water, clarifying the water, letting eelgrass grow, helping suppress harmful algae blooms. And on top of all that, it's a sustainable way to produce a great food product. So just in conclusion, I'm a huge supporter of aquaculture. I think it's one of the answers moving forward, both in terms of the American catch and in terms of restoring our local environments. Thank you.
At this point, I guess I should say what he said.
Thank you, Mickey.
My name is Mike Martinson. I met Mike Dole, my business partner, in 2004 at Stony Brook University. Having endured several fisheries collapses, and I spent my whole life making a living on the water west of here in waters that are a little, in my observation, sensitive and in direct trouble from the population density of city structure. The first fishery collapse that I endured was the eastern oyster, which in the early 90s allowed me to buy my first house. Set up my family making a living harvesting oysters from the wild population of Long Island Sound and Huntington Bay, and was making a great living. In 11th grade, $1,200 a day was pretty good. It's more than I've made since, actually. But, after getting married, and absolutely at the time I got married, there was a major collapse. Every oyster in the water bodies that I was familiar with was gone. They all died. We went from having millions and millions and millions of oysters in proximity, like sand on the beach. I mean, you could go and just, at times there were areas where you could walk the beach, lay a basket down on its side, and just scrape them in with your hand and fill the basket and put it on a truck. Down to zero overnight. There was two diseases, MSX and dermo, that were the main culprits that killed those oysters and put a lot of us out of business. And scrambling, especially in my case with a new family and mortgage, for something to do. And my next step was to fall into the Raritan Bay clam transplant. And I spent 5 years working Raritan Bay, digging clams with a bull rake and transplanting them out to the Peconic.
Some of that's actually New York City, right?
Yeah, that's up in New York City, in Staten Island, which was hit by QPX on a small level. We only lost about 20% of the wild population of clams in 2002. That was the third die-off. The second die-off was the lobster die-off of 1999. I had a wholesale lobster distribution business that I was running on the side while I was oystering, and one of the people I was selling oysters to was hit hard by the loss of oysters coming in and asked me if I could get lobsters instead. So I went down to the dock with his cash and I bought lobsters from a couple of guys' boats, and within the first year had 16 boats selling all of their catch to me. And then I was transporting lobsters up to Boston and making a really good living until 1999 when the lobster die-off hit the Sound, which I attribute to a major nor'easter that lasted 10 days, coupled with 11 days of rain, huge east winds, and a funneling effect of the surface waters, which had been tainted with malathion from the mosquitoes spraying. Surface water reached the bottom of the Long Island Sound, according to one of the professors I spoke to at Stony Brook, and just killed all the lobsters, which put me out of business in '99. And then when in 2002 the QPX hit the hard clams, I just threw my hands up. I was getting divorced, I wasn't making a living, and I was just done with the water. Even though I loved the ocean, I had some experience offshore on some of the Montauk boats. I had huge experience in the Long Island Sound trap fishing industry and gill netting, hard clam digging, oyster dredging. I went back to Stony Brook University looking for a path because I was lost. And I was thinking I wanted to be a wildlife veterinarian so I could work with marine mammals because I love them, like my family, who's here today. And I ended up meeting my future business partner unknowingly. Doing some undergrad research in the ecology lab, I met Michael Dole, who is like a big brother. I'm here because of him. I would have never started an oyster farm without him, although I wanted to. There's aspects of getting started that require a lot more diligence and attention to detail than I, as a fisherman, have the propensity for. So I think every fisherman should have a big brother scientist first. But if my time is getting cut short, the one thing I want to say, with all that experience of fisheries collapse and population density, I attribute it 100% to the population density of human population on the planet. This is not our planet. This is a planet that belongs to all life. It doesn't even belong to any life, but all life shares this planet, and we need to remember that. And in sharing this planet, I like to envision the planet as my mother, and as your mother, and the mother of all life. So of all people on this planet that I would respect, it would be the mother of my children, the mother of you and me. And so let's keep the earth in the forefront of everything we do.
We'll open the floor to questions in just a sec, but just one question. Oftentimes you hear within aquaculture that we're just replacing the wild with a farmed variant and we're ending up sort of poorer as a result. Can you talk a little bit about how farmed shellfish compare to a wild population, and do they do the same things in the ecosystem as a wild existing population of clams and oysters and scallops do? Anyone want to take?
Yeah, with shellfish aquaculture, shellfish do perform a lot of the same services that they do in nature as far as ecosystem services. They're still feeding, they're filtering the water, which clarifies the water. They are helping to possibly suppress algae blooms, also helping to alleviate hypoxia, which is low oxygen in the bottom waters. That occurs when a system's nitrogen polluted and there's large algae blooms, and then when the algae dies and sinks to the bottom, all the bacteria break it down and that uses up all the oxygen. Shellfish can help crop that algae crop before it all dies to the bottom and help reduce the severity or chances of hypoxic conditions. So it performs all those services. In addition, with aquaculture, there's another service. By the fact that we're removing the shellfish regularly, we're harvesting them and selling them, we're essentially removing nitrogen from the system. So the shellfish eat algae, and then they take all that nitrogen that the algae had taken up, and they put it into their own tissues and their own shell. And as we remove the shellfish from the system, we're removing nitrogen from the system. And it's debatable, how much nitrogen is being removed, at least in academic circles. It's a topic of debate, but the fact is that there is nitrogen being removed, and it depends on the location, and it depends on the size of the shellfish when you take it out. But just one number that I came across in a recent paper was harvesting 200 oysters a week, which for us is nothing, but 200 oysters a week will negate the nitrogen input from one household with a standard septic type system over the course of a year. And if you multiply that out, oysters aren't the solution to the problem. I mean, the whole problem, but it's definitely could be a significant part of any management plan to counteract nitrogen pollution in bays. So that's that. As far as the farm versus the wild populations, like I was saying before, the farm population spawns. The first life stage is a larval stage that spreads out across the bay, so it helps supplement. It could help supplement wild populations, not replace them, but help supplement wild populations. I'll leave it at that.
Can I add something real quick?
Yeah.
In Barley's case with the East Hampton Town shellfish program, when you plant the clams and oysters in the bottom, even if they're not caught, you're putting calcium back into the system that's been taken out. And it also, these shells also give an opportunity for the wild spat to attach onto with the loss of the eelgrass to set scallops or set a natural bed of oysters. So there is benefits.
Scallops will set on an oyster shell.
They'll set on anything.
Can I expand also?
Yeah.
The beauty of working with these low trophic level animals such as shellfish is that once we get out of the hatchery stage where we're growing algae food to feed the shellfish, all these shellfish are living on ambient bay water, so they're eating the exact same food that the wild population is eating. We're not depleting any other populations of anything to feed these shellfish, unlike other, different types of aquaculture, such as fish farming. These are all fish farms are fed, like a pelleted feed. Shellfish and other low trophic level aquaculture species are all just feeding on ambient food. And like Mike said, there's really no difference between the farmed shellfish and the wild shellfish as far as behavior, filtering abilities. There's no learned traits in these animals as there might be in others. So they're really they'll taste the same, they'll look the same for the most part. I mean, there's subtle differences, especially with oysters that are in the wild. Oysters will set on other oyster shell and other substrate, whereas cultured oysters are generally, single oysters, and we grow them that way for a reason, because they're easy to work with. But basically, the food aspect it's about as green as you can get, just feeding these animals ambient food.
Some questions from the floor? Yes.
How is acidification affecting
The question is, how is
your-
acidification
your
affecting?
industry, and what are the parameters that the shellfish will survive in?
Acidification it mostly affects shellfish at the larval level in developing their shell. It's a big problem on the west coast, mostly because the waters out there are so much deeper, and they have this upwelling effect where that acidic water is constantly being recirculated up to the surface, which is then being drawn into hatcheries. Here on the East Coast, our shelf is so shallow that, it's my theory that due to the photosynthetic properties of phytoplankton, basically what happens is in photosynthesis, the pH goes up when plankton and other plants are photosynthesizing. They're utilizing CO2 and driving the pH up. So my theory on the East Coast here is because our waters are so relatively shallow that acidity hasn't become a problem here because of all that photosynthetic activity due to plankton. So we haven't seen any problem, nothing like the West Coast. The West Coast shellfish, some of the shellfish hatcheries over there are basically decimated because of acidity. But here, so far, lucky.
First of all, I want to thank you for telling the stories that you told. They're really powerful, emotional, and fact-based at the same time, which is very important.
Maybe speak up just a little.
Yeah. So my question is, I've heard stories and read about problems and opportunities like this in New York, in Massachusetts, in Maine, North Carolina, Maryland. But I don't know if there is any body, whether that body is a person, like a senator, or a political body, that actually is providing any leadership on a national level around these issues, which I think are so critically important. Is there anybody providing national leadership?
Not that I know of.
I can't think of anybody.
Bob Rowe, maybe. I mean, the East Coast
Skid
Shell-
Row, yeah.
Yeah, there's a guy named
That's a
Bob,
good point, yeah.
nicknamed Skid Row, because his name is spelled R-A-T-A-A-U-L-T, and I think he came up with Skid so that people would know how to pronounce his last name. But the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association has been a really major force, and my experience anyway, they collaborate with the West Coast growers as well, the people in the Gulf Coast. I have to say, in traveling around the fishery sector, I do find people who are involved in shellfish aquaculture really closely tuned to what's going on in coastal environments. And, at the same time, I think people who work the water tend to be pretty independent, and associating and collaborating is an evolving thing to some degree. But maybe it's on the horizon. I don't know, that's my very surface level take on it.
On that subject, if I could just add real quick, sitting over there in the yellow shirt and across from him with the glasses, that's Avery and Michaela. Those are my children. They came with me to Washington, D.C. last year, and we met with senators and Congress people to discuss ocean acidification and the potential threat that we may be facing, as we're seeing on the West Coast, what we could be up against here on the East Coast. And we did have some pretty good results. There was, in one particular case, the NRDC was looking to increase support from Congress to study the potential for ocean acidification disaster or trouble here on the East Coast. And the federal government had in the previous years allocated $6 million to that, but after our meeting, the following day, they more than doubled that dollar amount. So there's a little bit of federal action for you. Thank you, children, for coming on. That was really cool.
Woman in the blue shirt.
There is a big program on ocean acidification through the National Marine Fisheries Service. The lab in Milford, Connecticut, the lab in Sandy Hook, New Jersey, have developed big programs on ocean acidification. That wasn't what I originally wanted to say, but I just thought I'd add that in at the beginning. About aquaculture, I've seen data, global data, showing that in the 1990s, the overall catch of fish and shellfish kind of leveled off. And all the increase that's still going on is from aquaculture. So aquaculture of not just shellfish but finfish is clearly the future, I think. And the shellfish aquaculture has proven to be much greener and producing much more environmental benefits and less problems than a lot of the finfish aquaculture has. So, I mean, I think this is where it's at.
Me too.
Yes.
I recalled reading an article about a study in New York Harbor waters. I think it went up to City Island, studying the oyster decimation and talking about reintroducing oysters into New York Harbor and that. What can you tell me anything more about that, or where that came from and where it's going?
Sure. That's something. That's a topic I was working on at Stony Brook University, so it's a subject close to my heart. Where it originates from is that oysters used to be plentiful in New York Harbor, as you look. So there was a historic, very plentiful population of oysters that had major impacts on the ecosystem. And that was, the natural oyster reefs. They were gone by the early 1800s, and the oyster fishery continued and thrived until the waters got too polluted. And so the interest in bringing back oysters to New York Harbor is one of environmental reasons, not fishery reasons, because it's still, I don't know if it will ever be clean enough to eat an oyster safely out of New York Harbor, but it's for...
It's the first chapter of my book. Is about.
Oh, yes.
I have to say that part of the book made me cringe. Don't do it! Don't do it!
Not because of the pollution.
I will say,
And also, it took you so long to find an oyster in New York Harbor, and then when you found one, you shoved it open and ate it.
in all honesty, it was Jim Lodge who opened it. So it was already dead, so I was just finishing the job. But I will say, so in the first chapter of American Catch, I kind of used the New York City restoration effort as a lens to look at the larger problem of shellfish restoration. But what's not in the book, and what I did notice, and it's very interesting, is I was at shellfish restoration projects in the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico, around Louisiana, is the largest wild oyster beds definitely left in the United States, maybe in the world. Amazing oyster beds that are actually shrinking, and but there is restoration going on. What's very interesting about a restoration project in the Gulf, or even the Chesapeake, is that if you want to restore oysters in the Chesapeake or the Gulf, what you do is you take a bunch of bags of oyster shell and you pile it up, and oysters set on it. Poof, you've got your oyster restoration. New York City, if you did that, if you piled up a bunch of oyster shell, they just get slimed. Nothing would happen. So that's for two reasons. One, there's a lot of slime. And number two is that there's the natural engine of oyster reproduction has been killed. That thing that used to produce quintillions of spat every single spring and summer, that doesn't happen anymore. So what's the most interesting thing I've been finding as I've been tracking the oyster restoration in New York City is there is now the New York Assembly Harbor School in New York on Governor's Island has actually established an oyster hatchery, and their plan, now there's a project there called the Billion Oyster Project, and the idea is to get 1 billion oysters into New York Harbor by 2025. We just did a talk in New York where one of the people in the audience said, who's an oyster guy, said, why such a modest goal? 1 billion oysters, because really you're talking about trillions that we need. But that effort is there, and it is an ecological thing, but it's also a sentimental thing. It's also like trying to say, well, if you can make it here in New York, you can make it anywhere. And I think if oysters can be restored to New York City, it really lowers the bar as far as an argument is concerned everywhere else in the United States, saying oysters can be restored. So, sorry to go on there. I think we're at the end of, we got 2 more minutes. I got one more question. Yes, in the back. Jeremy.
So I just wanted to ask you to put a finer point on this term aquaculture, because, you talked about the first chapter of your book, but then, of course, the second chapter of your book gets into shrimp. And, some folks would describe that as aquaculture as well. And, I think we have to be fair to ourselves in saying that some of these are, as standalone when assessed. What these gentlemen at the table are all doing. Okay, we can and we should feel good about that. But that's very different than how we should feel, based on what we learned in the second chapter of your book about shrimp in particular and that method of aquaculture.
Right. Well, aquaculture is the fastest growing food system on the planet. It's growing at something like 7 to 10% per year. And if I was an investment kind of guy, I would have my eye on it, because what grows at 7 to 10% per year in this economy? But one of the reasons that growth is happening is because a large part of aquaculture that's not shellfish aquaculture, things like shrimp, things like salmon, requires the reduction of wild things for the production of more farmed things. So for salmon, for example, when salmon aquaculture first started, it could take as many as 6 pounds of wild fish to make a single pound of salmon. The industry says they've got it down to below 2 to 1, but still a net loss of fish when you're talking about it. The ideal thing about shellfish aquaculture is it's potentially a net gain, unless somebody out there wants to eat all that phytoplankton directly. You're talking a net gain with shellfish. So, I think that aquaculture has a long way to go in other spheres. It's both a very old thing. Aquaculture goes back about 4,000 years to China, but the modern conception of aquaculture that we have right now, the so-called blue revolution, is about 50 years old. And a lot of mistakes were made at the beginning. Mistakes continue to be made, particularly in countries that don't have good regulation. And I should say the United States currently ranks 15th in aquaculture nations in the world by overall tonnage. We're right behind that roaring economy of Myanmar. So there's actually not a lot of aquaculture that goes on in this country. But one of the reasons, and we'll talk about this later, one of the reasons aquaculture maybe isn't so prevalent in this country is because we, unlike a lot of countries, still have very viable wild fisheries that, when managed well, can produce really great food, as is coming to your table right now. Thank you guys. Thank you to the chefs. You all here. I would like a round of applause for the restaurant owners. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the concerned citizens of Montauk. And really, at the end of the day, I think what we really have to do is thank Montauk. And thank you online. That is an amazing, beautiful place. When I went on Divorced Dad weekends, he always went to the Land's End. And to me, this is the ultimate Land's End, where the land end and the wildness begins. So let's all just, a big hug and a kiss. Thank you.